All right. Good morning, scholars. Welcome back. Happy Monday. This is the final 5-day push until the break. Remember that Monday and Tuesday of next week, December 21st and 22nd, will be an opportunity for you to complete any outstanding work that you have not turned in that might be dragging down your grade before those zeros are permanent in the grade book. That means this week, Monday through Friday, is the last push where you will have new work assigned, especially if you already have a few zeros, a few things you have not turned in that are hurting your grade. Make sure that you stay on top of your work this week so that you are in good shape going into the winter break. As a reminder, this is a half-year course. Our course ends on January 22nd, and we return to school January 3rd. That means that there are 2 or 3 weeks after we return, and then the class ends, and the average of your grade from quarter 1 and quarter 2 will be your final grade in World History 1, and will determine whether you receive the credits and pass. So especially if you are on the line or if you had a rough time in quarter 1, it is incredibly important that when we go into the break starting the end of the day next Tuesday, you are in good shape to pass. That being said, this week we are wrapping up Unit 6, which has been focusing on the Renaissance, and specifically this essential question of what makes a historical event a turning point. We started the unit talking about some of the characteristics of turning points, and we said that one of the major keys that tell us something is a turning point is that it's an event or series of events that changes people's way of viewing the world and their place in it. We talked about that change in worldview with the philosophy of humanism and this shift from the old way of thinking in the Middle Ages that humans were inherently wretched and needed to be saved by God, to humans being worthy and focusing on the capabilities and achievements of the individual. Another key focus of humanism is that humans do not need to rely solely upon a deity, a god, or another supernatural being, signs from the heavens, in order to understand their world, that humans themselves are capable of using logic and reason to understand the world around them. And that leads us into, towards the end of the Renaissance era, something that historians have come to call the scientific revolution. A big change in the way that we looked at the natural world. Something we're going to think about today is how did the Renaissance encourage changes in scientific thinking? Throughout the week, we're going to talk about some of the specific developments that came about during this time period that tie into the advances we're even seeing in science in our modern day. But importantly, to get started, we have to think about what is science and what forms of science existed prior to the Renaissance and prior to this scientific revolution. And remember that the focus question guiding our deeper inquiry here in this section, this part of the Renaissance, we're trying to answer the question, how do scientific advances threaten traditional authorities and beliefs? We often look at scientific advancement as a good thing, as a benefit to society. So it's going to be a little bit challenging for us to try and think about how traditional authorities, so people who traditionally have had power, how they might see scientific advances as threatening to that power, or threatening to wide-held or dearly held beliefs about how the world works and our place in it. Important to know that prior to the scientific reformation, as we know, challenging the church about what it taught could be very dangerous. And that isn't just what it taught about what, the message that God had for people. It wasn't just about the message of how to save your soul. anything the church taught. Remember, in the Middle Ages, in the medieval period, prior to the Renaissance, if anyone was educated, they were educated by a church. There was not a lot of education and innovation during the Middle Ages, but the only people who were getting educated at the church. And so challenging what the church taught about the world was very dangerous. And science before the Renaissance was largely based on myth, and those myths were then later supported by the church. And then remember that it was a crime to say something or to go against the church's teaching. So if you were a researcher or a theorist of any kind and you come up with a theory that actually the way you're thinking about the way the world works is wrong, just the same way that Martin Luther challenging the church and saying the way that you're telling people about God's word and the Bible is wrong, you could be burned at the stake. You could be charged with heresy, which was a high crime you could pay with your life. Before the Renaissance period, when we're talking about the 1600s now, what we call science was referred to as natural philosophy, and it was to varying degrees entangled with moral philosophy, theology, numerology, and even magic. So before this time period is things like magic and theology, which means religious studies, were deeply entwined with science. People didn't necessarily see clear distinctions between what was magic and what was science. In the Middle Ages, the word science was used just to mean knowledge in a generic sense. By the Renaissance, by the time we get to what we now call the Renaissance, science was often also used to mean art in describing a particular body of knowledge. So again, in the Middle Ages and up through the Renaissance, science just meant knowledge generally, and sometimes could mean a specific branch or specific type of knowledge. By the end of the 16th century, science requiring theoretical knowledge was often differentiated from art as a skill that required only practice. So art only required practice, but science required theoretical knowledge. In the Middle Ages and up through the Renaissance period, the church taught, here's what science was according to the church. The church taught that the earth was flat. The church taught that the earth was the center of the universe and everything moved around it. The church taught that dissecting human cadavers was an egregious sin. It was horribly bad. It was one of the worst sins you could do, the church taught. So people would not be cutting into human cadavers or corpses in order to learn about what was going on inside the body, because it was an egregious sin. They could be punished by the church, or being religious, as many people were at this time, would have believed that God would damn their soul for it. The church taught that one way to cure disease was through fasting and prayer. So they taught if you just abstain or you keep yourself from eating and drinking and you pray really hard, your disease will be cured. We saw some of that in the advice in the 14th century about, curing the Black Death. Certainly not nourishing yourself if you're sick. If you are sick, you should be taking in fluids, right? You should be eating as much as you're able to, because your body's using a lot of energy to fight off disease, but the church was teaching the opposite, and that was very dangerous. The church taught that diseases were punishments from God, another thing that we saw in some of that 14th century advice regarding the Black Death. And the church taught that everything happens for a reason and should not be questioned, because it's part of God's plan. We shouldn't try to come up with any other explanation except that God willed it to be so. And one of the largest discoveries was from a man named Nicholas Copernicus. He challenged the church teachings about Earth and the universe. Remember, that the church was teaching that the earth was the center of the universe and everything revolved around the earth. All other things in the cosmos, the sun, the stars, the moon, the other planets, revolving around the earth. And Copernicus challenged that. He believed the sun was the center of the universe when the church was teaching that the earth was. How did he risk heresy? This is called the heliocentric theory. Helio means star, and centric means center. So, if you haven't put it together quite yet, it's challenging this idea that the Earth is the center of the universe and suggesting instead that the sun, or this star, is the center of the universe. And then, after Copernicus, we have a guy called Johannes Kepler. Kepler built upon Copernicus's theory. Now, Copernicus, this guy here, he had spent an awful lot of time stargazing. He had watched the planets and the stars in the sky night after night for years. And so his heliocentric theory was all theoretical. He couldn't prove it. But after charting the movements of the stars, by charting what he saw in the night sky over long periods of time, he was saying this doesn't quite make sense. It wouldn't look this way if the Earth was at the center. In fact, it would only look this way, he thought, if the sun was at the center and the Earth, as with the other planets, were revolving around the sun. So Kepler, incredibly influential because he is able to use mathematics to prove Copernicus was right. Remember, it is incredibly dangerous that Copernicus was challenging the church because that was heresy. You could be put to death for it. And he was speaking out against the church without any way of proving that he was right and the church was wrong. But Kepler comes along and gives concrete evidence. He uses math to prove Copernicus would be right, and then he is also able to prove that the planets do not orbit in complete circles, they orbit in ellipses. This would be the ellipses here. Galileo, we talked about at the very beginning when we introduced some of the key developments during the Renaissance period. Galileo agreed with Copernicus, and then he further proved the heliocentric theory by inventing the first modern telescope. And he used it to discover other planets, such as Jupiter's moons, Venus, and he created a way to see that these planets and their moons, all of the other objects in our universe, in fact, do orbit the sun. So to go back and review, we have Copernicus, and he is the first one to challenge the church on the science that the church was teaching. Remember here, this is what the church was teaching up through the Middle Renaissance period. A lot of these were harmful and what we would consider today unscientific. But the main piece that these scientists are focusing on is that the Earth was the center of the universe, is what the church was teaching. Copernicus is the first one to challenge the church, saying the Earth is not the center of the universe. In fact, it is the sun, and this was the heliocentric theory. Kepler further supports Copernicus's heliocentric theory using math to prove Copernicus was right. And then to top it off, Galileo comes along and invents the first telescope that allows us to see the planets and the stars and their moons, providing the most concrete form of proof for Copernicus's original heliocentric theory.